Hello, Robert Perry Cruz back again, and welcome to the training video on preference assessments. This video serves as a follow-up to the training on reinforcement and goes into the steps of conducting a preference assessment. As with all of our videos on implementing skills, this serves as part 1 of your training. Part 2 will take place during our face-to-face meeting with hands-on instruction in actually completing a preference assessment. While this training has no guided notes, you'll find a group of related data sheets in your new hire packet. Keep those handy for reference throughout. Ready? Let's begin. Here are the new terms we'll be discussing today. By the end of both parts of this training, you will be able to conduct nearly all of these assessments with your student. First, let's review what a reinforcer is. A reinforcer is a stimulus change that immediately follows a response which increases the future probability of the occurrence of that response. In the most simple terms, a reinforcer is some consequence that increases the rate of a behavior in the future. Reinforcement is the key component of all procedures used to increase new behaviors. So how do we find one? Well, the only way to determine if something is a reinforcer, a food, a toy, a social interaction, is to deliver it as a consequence to a target response. Over time, if that target response happens more and more often, you've found a reinforcer. To do this quickly, you'd run a reinforcer assessment. However, isn't there a simpler way to find reinforcers? Happily, the answer is yes. Finding reinforcers can be accomplished through the use of a stimulus preference assessment. A stimulus preference assessment are sets of procedures used to determine stimuli that the person prefers and the relative preference values of those stimuli. In other words, a preference assessment can allow us to develop a hierarchy of which items are chosen more often than other items. We have years of research to show that the items students prefer the most will almost always also function as reinforcers. So, by using these procedures, we can develop a whole list of preferred items, with the most preferred serving as the student's strongest reinforcers. But why would we use any direct assessment, you might ask? Couldn't we just ask or observe the student? Well, sure, that's possible, but the data on successive guessing methods is pretty clear. It's not the best predictor of reinforcers. And if we don't have good reinforcers available, behavior change will be much, much more difficult. By directly assessing student preferences, we can better provide effective choices to individuals. Choice itself is actually a pretty great reinforcer. We can ensure that we're using items with reinforcing value to the student, thus improving our behavior change procedures. We also avoid the problem that is faced frequently in special education. Many students have difficulty making accurate choices. Conyers et al. Found that students unable to complete simple imitation tasks, to discriminate two items by their position, to complete nearly identical match-to-sample tasks, or to point at an object when given an auditory and visual cue, could not make accurate choices when given two items. By using these direct assessment methods, we have a much higher probability that the student understands the task and can make choices that reflect his or her actual preferences. Before choosing which method to use, we need to find materials. We can do this in a number of ways. We could observe the student, given free access to items in the environment, then use those that he or she spends the most time interacting with. We could interview the student's parents, either informally or with a structured interview questionnaire. There's one in your packet right now. We could also present small items, like edibles or toys, to the student and observe if he or she interacts with them. With any and all of these, the goal is to identify a bank of items, food, toys, activities, that can be used in your structured assessment. The simplest preference assessment is the single item assessment developed by Pace et al. In this assessment, the instructor presents items, either edibles or toys, singly to the student. The instructor allows the student to eat or play with that item for 10 seconds. If the student eats or plays with the item for 5 seconds, they score a plus on that item. If the student doesn't interact with the item, the instructor prompts them to do so, then represents those items again during assessment. Either they'll engage with them this second time, plus, or not, a minus. The pros of the single item preference assessment is that it's very, very quick and can help you determine some basic preferences. The cons are that it's not a great predictor of reinforcers, at least not as great as some of our other assessments. It doesn't give us any hierarchy either. Either they eat or play with the item, or they don't. Though this is rarely the only preference assessment we use, It's a great screen of your bank of items since it will determine if there are any items that the student won't interact with at all, meaning don't use them in a further assessment. A much more commonly used assessment is the two-item forced choice assessment, developed by Fisher et al. In this assessment, the instructor chooses a bank of items, typically 8. For every trial, the instructor puts 2 items in front of the student, equidistant from each other and from the student. The student chooses one item to eat or play with, and the instructor blocks any other responses, like trying to play with both items at the same time, by presenting the pairings of all the objects in your bank so that each object is paired with every other object and is on every position, either left or right. You'll be able to determine a preference hierarchy. Here's a short video showing the two-item forced choice assessment in action. You can follow along with your copy of the two-item datasheet in your packet. Pick one.
I place it. We don't have to do the matches.
My turn. Pick one.
Can I place it?
You can put one on. Put a sticker on.
Pick Woody.
Pick one.
See the fireworks.
My turn. Pick one.
Why are the Smiths out?
No, it's just Lily's hand. My turn. Pick one.
Hey, cool, ha.
Thank you.
I'm not a student now. I'm a student now.
You just don't know?
Yeah.
Okay. Pick one. Pick one. My turn.
I'm gonna pick only one,
Sounds good.
not two. I'm gonna be a
Pick one.
Woo, woo. I'm going to die. Not
My
yet.
turn. Ready? Pick one.
They still, right?
Pick one. Once the assessment is completed, we can produce a hierarchy of preference by dividing the number of times each item is chosen by the total number of presentations of that item. This is listed on your datasheet as 14. Then multiply by 100. Put the percentages for each item in order, and you've got your hierarchy. The top items will probably be the most reinforcing, so those can be used to reinforce the most important behaviors, while items in the middle or bottom will have weaker power as a reinforcer. Weaker reinforcers can still be used, they'll just probably be used more for skills that are in maintenance. Data collection is simple. Just write your items at the top, and then for each pairing, circle the item chosen. For those of you interested in practicing before our face-to-face portion of this training, here's a list of steps to complete to run a good 2-item forced choice preference assessment. First, in your setup, make sure you're following the array as written. Keep the items equidistant from each other and from the student. The SD for almost all preference assessments is pick one. Follow through. Remove the item that the student doesn't choose and allow the student 5 to 10 seconds of interaction with the item chosen. Block attempts to grab multiple items. If the student doesn't respond, prompt 5 seconds of interaction with each item. Then represent the trial. If they still don't respond, move on to the next one. For each trial, you'll be collecting data by circling which of the items was chosen. At the end, sum your results to find your preference hierarchy. Some pros of the 2-item forced choice assessment are that there is a high correlation between preferred and reinforcing items at the top of the hierarchy. Often, work sessions in which preference assessments are presented are considered very fun for students. A con is that this can take time, as it will probably take multiple sessions before completing all the pairings. It can be difficult for students who have challenges with discriminating sides. It also could result in challenging behaviors with students who have issues with denied access to items. Another type of preference assessment is the multiple stimulus without replacement assessment, developed by DeLeon and Iwata. When possible to use, this is my favorite preference assessment, based mainly on the speed with which it can be run. First, present 7 items in an array, equidistant from each other in the student. By cueing pick one, the student should eat or play with an item for 5 or more seconds. Block any attempts to grab multiple items, and represent the trial if there's no response. Between each presentation, you'll cover the items with some sort of a screen, like a binder or folder, so that you can rotate the item on the right to the left side of the array, then reposition the 6 remaining items. You'll repeat this procedure until the student has chosen all items, each time having 1 less item to choose from. Typically, you'll run this as a set of 7 sessions. Here's a video of the MSWO in action. Feel free to follow along with your corresponding datasheet if you like. You gotta be patient.
And then you get the table messy. Being a weird actor. I'm not a weird actor. I have a messy plate. Wait.
Pick one. You ready? Pick one. Pick one. Pick one.
That's okay. I can keep my hands up at dinner time.
Pick one. Nice job.
I'm gonna pick 2 or 1. 1.
You just listen to my instructions. Pick one. Once the assessment is completed, each block of trials is scored, with the first item chosen receiving a 7, the next a 6, and so on. Repeat for each block of trials, then add up the total score for each item. Once you've summed everything, put the items in order from highest score to lowest score to create your hierarchy. Here's our data sheet. Data is a little more complicated here, since you've got to both circle the item chosen, as well as write down what it was. With a little practice, you'll be flying through this assessment in no time. Since we'll be practicing this one further, you might want to review the steps of running the MSWO. First, your setup. Set your array of 7 items as prescribed on the data sheet. Make sure they're equidistant from each other and from the student. Provide the correct SD, pick one. Then follow through. Cover the items after the student has made his choice. Allow 5 to 10 seconds of interaction with the item. While the items are covered, rotate to the right. Block any attempt to grab multiple items. If the student does not produce a response, prompt interaction with the items. Then represent the trial. If they continue to not respond when presented with the items, end the session. For each trial, you'll collect data by circling the item and writing its name down. At the end, you sum your results to find your preference hierarchy. Just like with the other assessments, there are still some pros and cons. A pro is that the MSWO is very fast in producing a preference hierarchy. A con is that this assessment requires a student to be able to scan multiple items. There's some research to point to it not being quite as accurate as the 2-item forced choice assessment, but I've found it to be really effective. Also, just like with forced choice assessments, having so many items, of which only one can be picked at a time, may result in challenging behavior. While these 3 are the main preference assessments that you'll be using, there are some others that we'll review here. First, the brief MSWO. The brief MSWO is basically the same as the regular MSWO, except you'll only be running the first 3 to 4 trials, because past the first 4 items, we don't really care if the 3 items are that preferred. They're most likely weak reinforcers at best. This procedure is a quick alternative for running multiple MSWOs. It's a great check-in, say, after a vacation or after a few weeks of school, just to see if the students' preferences have changed. For students who prefer interacting with activities that can't be placed on the table, or for students who have difficulty with any of the other assessments, you could also use the free operant preference assessment. In the free operant preference assessment, multiple toy items are placed out in the student's reach. The student's allowed access to the items for 5 minutes. Across the 5 minutes, the instructor scores which items the student is playing with at the end of a 10-second interval, in a procedure known as momentary time sampling. By ranking each item by the percentage of intervals in which the student interacted with them, you set up a preference hierarchy. With this assessment, you could even have the student choosing to interact with multiple items at the same time, which could be useful information to have. Before we end, I want to address a few common questions I often hear in regards to using structured preference assessments. First, do you have to use items? Can't I use pictures? Students must demonstrate that they have the ability to match pictures to objects and objects to pictures in order to be sure that just using pictures will result in accurate preference hierarchies. What if I just ask what my student wants? Again, verbal assessments are not okay in isolation as a means of determining preferences. Since some of our students don't really understand verbal choice making, the preference hierarchy developed may not be accurate. Though there are times at which just asking could be okay, there are a lot of prerequisite skills required before this would be an appropriate technique to use. How often do I have to use this? Well, in terms of running a full preference assessment, we recommend that a preference assessment be run at least after every report card period, usually 3 or 4 times a year. You can always ask students what it is they'd like to earn from the items chosen from the preference assessment. Breakboards should be developed from the results of these preference assessments. Should the items really always be present? There is some research to point to the fact that some students were able to choose from printed cards and still develop an accurate preference hierarchy. It's unclear if that would work for a population of younger children or students with limited verbal language. So, preference assessment isn't the same as reinforcer assessment? Nope. Preference just tells you how much a student prefers something over something else. A reinforcer assessment will actually tell you if something functions as a reinforcer. Great! I love it, Rob. I'll do this all after lunch. Hold on, remember motivation. If you're using edibles, do the assessment during periods of deprivation. So, before lunch or very far after breakfast. If you're doing something with activities, try to do the same. Take some of the activities you think are most preferred and put them away on the shelf for a few hours or even one day, and then bring them out the next day as part of the assessment. As always, this training couldn't have been created without the research and hard work of many talented individuals in this field. If you're interested in learning more, many of these references can be found online, some for free, or in our training library. Thank you so much for watching this video on preference assessments. Remember, just watching doesn't mean you've achieved proficiency. We'll work towards that in our next face-to-face meeting. In the meantime, if you have any questions or feedback on this or any other training, please don't hesitate to email me. Take care.